Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Global Café. Like Luana said, my name is Kara Cruz, and I'm a Senior Policy and Project Coordinator here at the IFA. Today, I am very excited to be introducing you all to Dr. Ralph Martins, who will be joining us in a conversation on the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of Alzheimer's disease. So over the last 30 years, Professor Martins' insights into Alzheimer's disease has led to a number of groundbreaking discoveries, recognition of his tireless pursuit of research excellence and functional clinical outcomes have come in the form of over 350 peer-reviewed publications published in prestigious high-impact journals such as the Journal of the American Medical Association and cited over 12,000 times since 1996. He has delivered numerous keynote presentations and has a history of securing research funding, encouraging community engagement, and bolstering industry collaboration. He has generated commercially and clinically valuable intellectual property with 8 patents leading to commercialization outcomes. He holds numerous adjunct professorial appointments with esteemed universities around the world, and in recognition of his outstanding research achievements, Professor Martins has been awarded a number of very prestigious accolades, including the Melvin Jones Award from Lions Club International, USA, in 2010. So this is the highest award the Lions bestow, recognizing outstanding community service, and he is one of only 2 recipients in the past 25 years. He is also one of the IFA's directors, and we feel very fortunate to have him here with us today. So thank you very much, Ralph, for joining us.
Thank you, Kira, and thank you for your kind words.
Of course. So before we speak about Alzheimer's disease, I wanted to ask a little bit more about you. So what attracted you to the field of brain research, brain health, and why have you remained working in the field?
Good question. I got into brain research and particularly Alzheimer's disease a good 40 years ago. And my father-in-law was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he was only 61 at the time. So that's why I got involved in it. And the plan was to learn a bit about the disease, help the family be informed, and then move on. I had a job lined up in New Zealand. But 40 years later, I'm still here. So I really got drawn in. I obviously had a personal investment in this disease. And it's sort of it was a hard disease to work with. I remember my mentor at the time, Professor Colin Masters, who's a neuropathologist, said to me, "Don't waste your time with this, because all we do is we look at the brain after someone's died, and that's when we give a real definite diagnosis." So that was in the 80s, and it's all changed. But it was a slow process for a while. But you just got to believe in it, and you really want to make a difference. And that's why I wanted to be in it. I wanted to see an outcome. It's come slow, but the good news is that now we're having effective treatments coming to bear. So that's a real reward for being in there for so long. And also early diagnosis has now become a reality. Mm-hmm. And I think I've been able to infect people in my own team who stayed with me for now decades to work on this problem. So obviously, it's an awful disease, but we are passionate about really making a difference.
Thank you for that. And I think it's interesting, that idea of needing to sustain hope throughout the kind of course of your career, especially at those early stages when you don't know if there will be a successful outcome, successful treatment. That must be quite difficult. So typically when we, actually, to ensure that we all have the same understanding, first of all, throughout today's conversation, could you explain to us what Alzheimer's disease is and how it's distinct from dementia?
Yeah, so dementia is basically an umbrella term. It really means a loss of mind, but it covers a number of diseases that lead to basically neurons dying, and it's a debilitating condition. So Alzheimer's disease probably accounts for 70% of all cases. And then we have other conditions such as vascular dementia. Again, there's a decline in cognition. And then we have a condition like Lewy body disease and frontotemporal disease. And they express themselves slightly differently in terms of behavior. But at the end of the day, brain cells die, and people eventually succumb to these terrible diseases. Alzheimer's is different from the others in that we understand what we call the molecular pathology of the disease. We understand that there is a particular protein that builds up in the brain. This protein is known as amyloid, and everyone makes it, but when its levels get high, brain cells die, people get disease. It's as simple as that. And we know that, for example, if you have a genetic mutation that it can cause Alzheimer's, it's relatively rare, but in these cases, they get an overproduction of amyloid. And the disease can express itself clinically as early as the 30s, early 30s. So very, very, very nasty form of dementia. But with the majority of us, the older that we get, we have an inability to clear the amyloid. So it's more getting rid of it fast enough. And so it starts building up. So that's the unique form of amyloid for Alzheimer's. And in the 80s, when I joined Professor Colin Masters, we didn't know what was that amyloid. They called it amyloid, but they didn't know what the protein was. So Professor Masters was a neuropathologist. I'm a biochemist. I like to understand the molecular basis of disease. And we focus on isolating the proteins in these deposits. And that protein today is known as beta amyloid. And I always tell people, beta amyloid is to Alzheimer's what cholesterol is to heart disease. We all make it, but when the levels go high, we get the disease. And that now led to a lot of research to show that that was a major feature of the disease. And in the last 25 years, drug companies have been targeting it to develop treatments. And now finally, we've got some effective treatments coming on board.
Perfect. Thank you very much for kind of elaborating further on that. That's really helpful. So we are going to talk about treatments shortly, but first just wanting to continue building our understanding of Alzheimer's disease itself. Typically, when we hear the term Alzheimer's disease, we think of memory loss being primary and most impactful symptom. Is this correct, or are there other symptoms that accompany the disease?
Yeah, I think memory loss is a really major factor in Alzheimer's disease, and usually starting with short-term memory. And that's because particular regions of the brain to do with memory and learning are compromised. But many people, those who don't have a family member, for example, just think it's memory alone, and it's not. So there's associated behavioral problems that come hand in hand with the memory. It varies between individuals. We see agitation. We see people getting depressed, as a result of frustration of the disease. So there are many aspects that affect behavior that need to be considered with someone with dementia. But the primary cause is the loss of memory.
Okay, thank you. So you spoke about the depression that can accompany the disease. Is there a relationship between mental illness and Alzheimer's disease?
I think we need to be clear that Alzheimer's disease is a neurological condition. Brain cells are dying. That leads to these other problems. And so you do get these associated behaviors, but they're not the primary cause of the disease. But however, there is some debate about depression. So some people are shown to have depression before the onset of symptoms of Alzheimer's. And the question is depression playing a role in causing it, or is it as a result of the disease? And that's still being debated. So depression is probably the only thing that's very tightly linked and maybe playing an important role in the pathogenesis of the disease.
Okay, that's fascinating. So the potential for it to be an early symptom that maybe doesn't go recognized
Yes.
always. I see. So like you said earlier, there are numerous potential contributors to an individual being diagnosed and presenting with Alzheimer's disease. Are there any behavioral changes that individuals can adopt to reduce their risk?
Definitely. And I think the most important fact that we now come to recognize is that lifestyle is a big player in dementia. Many of my colleagues 20 years ago would dismiss lifestyle. They thought the brain was unique, but lifestyle for Alzheimer's is no different to lifestyle for heart disease or cancer. And so we know, for example, that diet plays a big role in protecting our brains and adhering to particular types of diet he performs will be important. So, for example, our team here in Australia have been looking at a study called the Australian Imaging Biomarkers Lifestyle Study of Aging, where we've been following initially 1,200 people, now it's as much as 2,000 people for the last 14 years, and asking the question, can we diagnose Alzheimer's early during life? Does lifestyle matter? And we could see from our studies that people who adhere very strongly to a Mediterranean form of diet, they have a markedly lower deposition of amyloid in their brain. So clearly, if you're on a Mediterranean diet, that's very helpful. And it's pointing out more to be the fruits and vegetables, so the antioxidants in our diet can be very protective for the brain. Likewise, we also see that exercise is important. And what type of exercise matters? Aerobic as well as resistance-based exercise that can help, and it's shown to help clear the amyloid. So that's one of its features, but it has other benefits as well. Improve blood flow to the brain, as well as paying attention to vascular risk factors, such as your cholesterol, your blood pressure, and people also maintaining their activity, their cognitive activities, doing things. People talk about crossword puzzles, but there are more sophisticated approaches in which we can basically activate our brains in terms of computerized programs that get harder and harder, and we implement that. But very recently, when I say recently, probably in the last five to 7 years, there was a major study led by Professor Mia Kivipelto in Finland, and she looked at all these factors together and showed a profound effect in lowering the cognitive decline as we get older. So that's been a huge game changer. And people have around the world now are following that approach. So in the United States, they have what we call the US pointer study. They didn't like the word fingers. And in Australia, we have the Australian arrow. And there are China, Japan. So it's called the Fingers, Worldwide Fingers Program. People can Google it to learn more about it. But this approach, this is what we call a multi-domain approach, seems to be very powerful in prevention. And so, yes, so by changing our behavior to adhering to these lifestyle approaches can have a huge impact on lowering our risk.
Thank you. And making note of a comment made within the chat, as well as kind of my own thinking. So when you say that certain lifestyle factors can clear amyloid plaque from the brain, couldn't this be considered reversing Alzheimer's, or is that a very completely different thing?
That's a very good question. I think the earlier we start, it could have that impact. So what we've come to recognize now is that we can diagnose Alzheimer's 20 years before the onset of symptoms. So really, people are getting dementia in their 60s. It's starting in the 40s, the disease. So starting at that point, the earlier we start, when the brain is still relatively spared, the neurons are not dead, we could effectively, significantly prevent the onset or delay it by probably decades. We don't have that answer now. What we have now is treatments for people who are showing symptoms. But as I speak, there are two major studies. Trailblazer 3 is one of them, where we're looking at people who are cognitively normal, they've got amyloid in their brain, and ask this very question: can we prevent the onset of symptoms? It's a long study, but that will then be a game changer. So in effect, treating people in their 40s may be the way to go.
Yeah, that's fascinating, this idea that it develops so much earlier than we think. I think quite often we do think of Alzheimer's as a disease that accompany or can accompany older age. So how can individuals be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and why is early diagnosis so important?
Yeah, so the whole field has changed hugely. As I said at the start, the only way people could be diagnosed with any certainty was after they were dead. A bit late for the person, but it's useful for the family. Now, because with the advent of real high-powered technology, we can look into the brain during life. We can take pictures of the brain. We can see this amyloid in the brain. It's a technique called PET amyloid imaging. And this is the one that allows us to see it 20 years earlier. And so by doing that, we can pick it up well before symptoms appear, and it allows us to intervene much more effectively as a result of that. We see this as the first stage. This early diagnosis by imaging is good, but we have an issue. It's not going to be something that's going to be accessible to everybody. We don't have the facilities, say in Australia, but anywhere in the world, to the 400,000 people once this drug becomes available. So what we are now looking at is developing a blood test. That's what my team are doing. That would be a very cost-effective, that would make it much more accessible to the wider community to be tested. Because if you're having a single brain scan that's costing you $3,000 to $5,000, it's pretty daunting. And then you need to have follow-up ones as well. So that's where we are heading towards in early diagnosis, which will then make it really important for effective treatments. Because from the current treatments that are now happening, the treatments will be restricted to people at early stage Alzheimer's, because that's where they're seeing the best effect. So the earlier you get tested, the earlier you're picked up, the better benefit you're going to get from that treatment. This is
Okay,
using just anti-amyloid drugs. There could be other and there will be other treatments that will come about that will complement the anti-amyloid treatment.
so when you say early stages of Alzheimer's, do you mean before someone presents with symptoms or those early stages?
No, so this means early stages clinically. So
Mhm.
they're showing symptoms, but at an early stage. And I don't know when we're going to talk about drugs, but with the drugs coming on, the first drug was a drug called aducanumab. It had a small benefit. What it clearly did was it got rid of all the amyloid. That's something we thought would never happen. So there's no question you can clean the brain of amyloid. But the drug that followed is lecanemab, which is now being used in the United States. I think it came out about over a year ago in the United States. That showed a 20% improvement in slowing the cognitive decline. So not only does it clean the brain of amyloid, it's showing a clinical benefit. And the drug that's coming on its heels, and only about 2 weeks ago, it was the FDA advisory committee has unanimously passed it, is donanemab. And that's been shown to slow the effects of cognitive decline by as much as 60%. So that's really powerful in terms of slowing cognitive decline.
Certainly. Do you think that these drugs have the potential to be a cure for Alzheimer's, or will this really be a slowing of
That,
disease
that's
progression?
yeah, I'd love to say that, but no.
Mhm.
It's going to be a powerful tool for us to target and slow the progression of the disease significantly. If you buy an extra 12 months, but someone can live independently. For family members, that's a big thing. For the person, is obviously a big thing. So that's where these are, and they're going to get better and better. So I just said the second drug that's going to come on board is going to be 60%. I reckon the next one is going to be even better still. But then we want to look at other drugs. There's another protein called tau that builds up in our neurons, and tau is found in all forms of dementia. The drugs are now being tested for that. And I expect that when we have a combination of the tau antibody treatment and the anti-amyloid treatment, we're going to see a much more powerful effect. So we'll be getting close, but cure is a very, very strong term that I wouldn't use. And I think other factors need to be looked at. For example, 40 years ago, I published the first paper to show that the brain was under oxidative stress. No one believed us then, but now it's well recognized that it's a major feature of the disease. So basically, think of the brain rusting, not enough antioxidants getting to the brain. So we think antioxidants may be a really important factor that would complement the anti-amyloid treatment. But a cure is something I think that's going to be a hard one. I think in the future, people will be looking at stem cells. They're already testing them out now to repair the disease process. The anti-amyloid treatment, you can think of as something that getting rid of the toxic substance, but then that infrastructure in the brain needs to be repaired. So we need to look at systems. That's the way I see it going, as helping rebuild those connections, get neurons getting in there and doing it. It's a good 10 years of work before we get to that stage.
Thank you very much for that imagery of kind of comparing the different approaches to treatment. That's really helpful. Earlier, you mentioned how when you first started within the field, that it was following an individual's death. That's when then they could be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and to let the family know. Is there a genetic link to Alzheimer's disease?
It's a big genetic link. There's in some families, there's a gene, we call it presenilin 1. There's another gene known as presenilin 2, and there's a third gene known as APP. These genes, if you have a mutation in them, you make too much amyloid and you get Alzheimer's early. You never escape the disease. You definitely get the disease. So that's very strong evidence to show that they cause Alzheimer's disease. But then there's another genetic risk factor that accounts for as much as 50% of the people who get Alzheimer's. It's known as ApoE4. It's a gene that's associated in the past with high cholesterol, but is a very strong risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And if you get one copy, which accounts for 20% of us in the population, your risk is tripled. If you have two copies, most people don't escape the disease. So this is an important genetic risk factor, but I always tell people, well, we can't change our genes, but we can change the expression of our genes by what we do. And this is an example where lifestyle can play a very strong role in changing that expression. So it puts you at risk, but you can basically attack that risk by lifestyle. So ApoE4 is something we need to, and the other thing to note is these drug treatments are not side effect free. There is a serious side effect in some people, and unfortunately the ApoE4 people have a higher risk of bleeding of the brain. This is managed in the US now. They've had 15 months of experience. It's got to be very closely monitored, but it is a risk factor that we need to pay attention to, the high risk in these people.
Thank you. Yeah, it's such a complex issue. So speaking of risk factors for the expression of genetic kind of predisposition to Alzheimer's or development of Alzheimer's, we have a question in the chat from Shmuel. So Shmuel is a regular contributor to the IFA Global Café. And he's wanting to know, what are the impacts of poverty and low socioeconomic status on the development of Alzheimer's disease?
That's another very good question. There's very little we know enough to really make a statement. It seems to be more a disease of the wealthy. Our lifestyle, what we eat seems to put us at higher risk. We're living longer, but so I don't have an answer to that. That's we don't see the incidence, for example, higher in countries that have got a lower socioeconomic status. In fact, when those countries have improved their status, their risk seems to increase. Well, people live longer. Aging, unfortunately, the longer we live, the higher the risk. So it's a bit complicated. But I personally haven't gone into that area, and I've seen very little work done on that. But it's a very good question.
Thank you, and thank you, Shmuel. You always challenge us to kind of expand our thinking, which is fantastic. So knowledge translation, it's a bit of a buzzword within academia at the moment, and for very good reason. How have you supported knowledge translation mechanisms within your own research and expertise?
Yeah, so I'm very passionate of getting, the knowledge we have out there to the community as much as I possibly can. And I do a lot of radio interviews, I do television interviews, but I also give public lectures to community groups throughout the country and abroad. I give a public lecture on average once a week, sometimes even twice a week. So that gives you an indication of how much we try to get that information out there. But I've done a bit more than that. I've written a book called Understanding Alzheimer's for the community to better understand the disease and the risks, the causes. But I've done also stuff with, I mentioned to you about food being so important. In Australia, we have a very famous cook, Maggie Beer. She's much loved in the community here. No one reads my papers outside the scientific community, but everybody knows about her. So I partnered with her, and we wrote a book called Maggie's Recipe for Life. So I wrote the first 50 pages of what's good for your brain, but she made these beautiful recipes. And it was a bestseller. We did incredibly well with that. So that was really a high impact. And the second edition is coming out very shortly. So that's one way. We also wanted to look at reaching out to young children, starting early. And we've got a book that we published with Sally Yule that's called basically Dancing with Memories, and really about an older grandma who had the condition, but we looked at the positive aspects of of getting the community involved in, rather than the stigma that's associated with seeing how they could support someone with Alzheimer's, and getting young children to recognize it, and what young children can learn from that, and also at the same time introduce young children to healthy eating. So Maggie, at the end of that book, has made some beautiful lunchbox recipes, and that was very popular. We're now developing a second book. It's just being printed as I speak, about dancing with emotions. We talked about the behavior, which is another important aspect. So that's how I've been trying to do it in my small way. I think more scientists are trying now to communicate their findings to the wider community.
Yeah, it really is so critical, and I think it can be quite enjoyable to challenge yourself to do so as well.
Yes.
Especially when we were speaking earlier in the week, just thought it was so fantastic, this life course approach to Alzheimer's disease of educating young children so they can understand what's happening perhaps with their own loved ones, but also perhaps kind of imprinting those lessons quite early in life.
And in Australia, we have a television program, and a couple of our geriatricians, clinicians, organized that, where they had little children coming into aged care homes, and the impact it had on the people with dementia, and also older people, and on the children in a positive way, was amazing. So there was a lovely engagement between the intergenerational.
Yeah, it's an approach of the decade of healthy aging for a good reason.
Yes.
So I see that we're getting quite a few questions in the chat. I believe this is Eileen who is asking, what are your experiences with a study on PET scans? Eileen, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Martins. I'm just zoning in on a few minutes ago when you were talking about PET CT scans. If somebody gets a PET CT scan and there is cortical amyloid deposition using, I don't understand this, but the scale of BAP L3 or something. And what are the treatments after that if it's positive? And does the treatment using donepezil slow this down?
Yes, very good questions. So prior to the drugs that are now coming on board, and these drugs are called disease-modifying drugs, the most common drug was a drug like donepezil, but they are treating symptoms, those drugs. So they don't have an impact on lowering the amyloid. The disease-modifying drugs actually do that. They get rid of the amyloid. So people who are shown to be amyloid positive and are shown to have clinical symptoms at an early stage can now be eligible to get these anti-amyloid drug treatment. We also have challenges with cost. I don't know what it's like in other countries, but in Australia, the cost is supposed to be $38,000. So that's a lot of cost for accessibility. We are hoping that our government regulatory body will basically put it on the PBS, which is the scheme which allows then drugs to be given at a significantly subsidized rate, and that would then increase accessibility. But that is a big concern. I imagine our drug will be coming out, the first drug, lecanemab, in Australia, probably by the middle of this year or towards the later end. And the people who are going to get access to it in the first instance will be people who can afford it. But the real aim is to try to get it to the wider community, and this is where we need government intervention. We also have issues with infrastructure. So many people are worried, clinicians, that we don't have the infrastructure in place, and we need to build that infrastructure. So, this drug requires people to get infusions. They go into hospital and they get an infusion, and it's just a 4-hour operation procedure. The hospitals are just in Australia don't have the capability to do it. So this is where we see philanthropy and industry coming and helping build this infrastructure. And an example here in Western Australia, we have the Alzheimer's Research Australia. It's basically a foundation, and they are basically setting up the first of its kind in our state. And we hope there'll be more like that to help then make it more accessible. But we also need to have, as I said, better screening system. So the amyloid test that you mentioned is definitely the gold standard now, but it's not going to make it accessible to the wider community. So we have to have this blood test for Alzheimer's sooner than later.
Thank you very much. And why bother taking that? People being prescribed that donepezil when it's only treating symptoms. I'm trying to understand what symptoms are they treating? Is it doing anything? Is it just a placebo?
Yes, so unfortunately, if you talk to most geriatricians who treat patients, they say it's not doing much. It's doing very little. There are a few individuals who do get a benefit. Their memory stays stable for a while, but for a relatively short period of time. Yeah, so it was all that people had. But most people don't get a benefit from donepezil. And like you said, because it's treating symptoms, as the disease progresses, it'll have no effect.
Thank you for that. And Eileen, does that answer your question?
Yes, and it raises more questions, especially when we know what's actually happening with amyloid dispositions. And just recently, I'm in Ireland, and recently I read an article in the newspaper to say if your mother, not your father, had Alzheimer's, the chances are you're going to get it as well, whatever the genetics are there. I don't know, is that research international or just local?
Yes, I think the evidence is not out there to indicate that. I mean, it could be, say, for example, if mom had that gene that causes Alzheimer's, then of course once one of the kids were to receive it, they'd get the disease for sure. But from all the evidence we see, there's no particular gender that imparts an increased risk of Alzheimer's. Having said that, though, we do know that twice as many women than men get Alzheimer's. So it's a major factor. In Australia, it's the leading cause of death in women. So there is something in women that we need to understand that we didn't pay attention to in the past. People would say, oh, yeah, women just live longer, and that's why they get Alzheimer's, but that's not the case. There are some other factors that need to be considered.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Eileen. I agree. The more we talk, the more questions that also go through my mind as well. So going to a question that relates a little bit to what you were speaking about, Ralph, when you were talking about the need for the blood test and the need for healthcare infrastructure to kind of catch up to this treatments that we have available. Catherine is asking, do you have any advice for health system planners as new therapies are introduced, especially while early identification of those who might most benefit aren't available?
Yes, that's a very good question. I don't think I could be able to do enough justice to it, but what we clearly need is multidisciplinary teams to be able to address this, and we need obviously a lot more engagement with government to help deliver that infrastructure. People are worried that we're not going to even have doctors to, for example, deliver the treatment. In the United States, there's a very prominent neurologist who we were lucky to have him come to Australia, and Dr. Salloway, and he has got a big center, and they now use a lot of nurse specialists and nurse practitioners. So we got to start thinking of them, that they would probably play a bigger role in getting the treatments out. So we need to be thinking differently, educating and even educating groups, allied health groups who would help in delivering this. So there's a lot of planning needed. I'm not the best person to basically give advice on that, but I know that our government bodies now are paying serious attention to this aspect of things.
Thank you. And when you're speaking about looking at non-physician kind of physicians and how they might support the treatment of Alzheimer's, is there any kind of focus on educating these groups on symptoms of Alzheimer's in order to encourage their patients who they may be seeing for a different reason to explore diagnosis at all?
Yes, I think there's a huge need to bring education into to educate, to make people more aware and what to be looking for, including doctors, GPs need to be more and better informed about this. And I think also need to pay attention to different cultural communities, because some communities tend to be sidelined or not, don't have the access as much as they should. So we need to be giving that some thought, how we make them aware of the importance of such interventions.
Thank you. While we're speaking about multidisciplinary teams, we have another question from Shmuel, who's asking, how can occupational therapy support effective treatment in Alzheimer's? I'm not sure if this is something you've explored much.
No, we haven't, but I think it's going to be important in terms of not so much treatment, but I guess more in terms of even prevention. And I think like I said, we need to look at this in a multimodal approach. So occupation therapists in that respect would have a big role. And even people who do have dementia, we see that lifestyle can make a difference. Lifestyle does matter. So, for example, people who got early stages Alzheimer's, and if they just walk a lot consistently and longer, there's a benefit there. So a lot of activities like that, where I think occupation therapists could play a role in helping, and even we mentioned about people who start showing initial symptoms. They lose interest in hobbies, they lose interest in certain activities, and so if they were given some support in that way, that could be a significant benefit.
Certainly.
It's all about improving quality of life.
Yeah, and holistically recognizing that an individual is more than physical health. We're a whole collection of experiences. Turning a little bit more to the clinical side of things, Maria has a question about the decrease of dementia incidence in Europe. Maria, would you like to unmute and ask your question? I'm not sure if you're still with us.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Well, I would like to address the issue of prevention, because you already talked a lot about prevention,
Yes.
but I think we should look at causes of causes. For instance, in Europe, we didn't have the big epidemic that was announced in the 1990s.
Yes.
Well, most researchers said that it is because of the education. High education is now available for everybody in Europe. And like in my country, in Spain, we had only 25% of people that could read and write in the 1970s. One of the lower education in Europe. And we didn't have this epidemic. But it is not only education. So my question is about, is it possible that lowering poverty, lowering stress, lowering violence in general in Europe has caused an increase in education, good nutrition, good health habits? I don't like to mention lifestyles, but I think most people are not able to choose their lifestyles, but people are more free to follow ways of life, health habits. And my question is it possible to continue putting money on prevention? Because I am quite skeptical. As you said already, the cost of drugs is huge and unaffordable. Like in many European countries, we have free medication and we have practically all medication. But due to drug patents, the way that medical pharmaceutical companies are using patents, we need to pay incredible amounts of money to get access to medication. And our public health system cannot afford this. So my question is, how much weight would you put on prevention? Do you think that prevention is the likely cause of the decrease of dementia in many countries of the world?
Yeah,
Thank you.
your questions are amazing. There are a lot of very thoughtful comments in there. I think prevention is going to be key. So in terms of the risk factors in prevention, it's thought, and that was the Lancet Commission that came out a few years ago to indicate that it accounts for as much as 40% of all people who get dementia. Now, we think that's underestimated. In that commission, they didn't look at sleep. We now recognize that sleep is a major risk factor, post-sleep, for dementia. You get a marked buildup of amyloid in the brain. So I don't know in your country what process have taken place, but what you say makes good sense. If stress is a key factor, so if one can bring stress down, that definitely will be beneficial. And violence, especially head injury, is another major feature, as well as sport. I guess so now we are in Australia, we have become more sensitive to head injury associated with sport. So those are the factors. There are many factors that can play a role. Unfortunately, in Australia, where we have the people who are educated, we have a good lifestyle in terms of food, climate. Our numbers are increasing. We've got close to 500,000 people with dementia, and we are a small country in terms of numbers. So maybe Europe is doing, maybe it's the red wine in Europe. I'm joking, but it's, the antioxidants are really powerful. So there's something about Europe, and I think the Mediterranean style of eating, a lot of countries in Europe are fairly significantly adhering to that, and that may be a feature. We see the reverse things. For example, people who go from, say, Africa or from Japan to the United States, they were in an area where there was low risk of dementia and their risk increases. So that's clearly a significant lifestyle change there. But we haven't seen the reverse. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Maria, again. Next, we have a question from Cynthia Stewin, your fellow board member. Cynthia, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Cynthia.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this wonderful cafe. And I've really enjoyed the way you were able to present what is very complex to a broad audience, and it's really a gift. So thank you. But I also followed some of the research and the controversy of the research, some of it, with hearing loss and the relationship. Could you comment from your perspective, knowing much more about the status of current research in that area, about the relationship or association with hearing loss?
That's a very, very important point that you raised, Cynthia. Hearing loss now is becoming increasingly more considered to be a risk factor for dementia. There's no question about that, and the evidence is getting stronger and stronger. Whether hearing loss causes dementia directly, we still don't have those answers. Or is it associated with the disease? But we know, for example, people who have hearing loss tend to be more isolated, and that then impacts on them, loneliness, and all those factors come into play. So it's a very complex interplay. Some of my colleagues at Macquarie University and elsewhere are doing a really detailed work looking at that to assess that. But we do know that if you give people hearing aids, that really helps reduce the risk of dementia. So it's a very important feature. It's hearing, and we know that part of the brain with hearing is very close to the parts to do with memory and learning. So they're very closely connected, those parts of the brain. So there's a lot more for us to learn, but it's definitely a very important aspect that we need to pay attention to.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now to turn back to a question regarding diagnosis.
Yes.
Vicky Vass here has a question. Vicky, would you be able to unmute? Otherwise, I can ask your question.
Yeah, I can do that. Hi, Ralph.
Hi, Vicky.
I know that you and the team are working really, really hard to find that accessible blood test that allows that early detection. Is there any way that it can be accelerated? And if it can, what would it take to make that happen?
Yeah, so that's the biggest problem with research. We tend to be drip fed with funding, and that's why things take a lot longer. Many governments still don't appreciate how important this area is. I think except in the United States, that's a huge amount of funding to advance the stuff. But we seem to struggle, and that's the biggest limiting barrier for us. Like if for example, we had $20 million, we could fast track this process. We got some money from a foundation to make our own antibodies, because what I want to do in Australia is I want to get a blood test down to $200 or less, so that it's very accessible to everyone. So we wanted to make our own antibodies, and we were very lucky that a philanthropic family gave us $100,000. It's not a huge amount of money, but enough to make those antibodies. So we've made them. I'm sending my team to Sweden to work with the team there to develop the blood test. But the whole process will cost us at least $10 million to take it for more to go. But it will be a huge impact, not just for Australia, but for many other countries. So that's our life's mission now, to try to make that happen. There is a blood test that's coming out of the United States that's FDA approved. It costs $1,500 US. A single blood test. It's just ridiculous. So we want to get something that's more effective and much more costly, less costly as well.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Ralph. For anyone who's interested, what is your team's name, or how can they follow the progress of your work?
So we have a foundation, and I'm very grateful to the foundation, because without them, we wouldn't be able to do the work we do. It's called Alzheimer's Research Australia. And they basically fund it. So there's a website that I think we've sent some details for anyone that's want to follow the work we do. So prevention is one of our big areas of that we're doing, a major prevention trial in Australia, and looking at early diagnostics. We're not just looking at a blood test, we're also looking at the eye, because we can now see at the back of the eye amyloid, which reflects amyloid in the brain. And that'd be something that we could do to people who are in remote areas, we easily access. So that's another major line of research. And I've also sent some slides to Luana, to that people can have access to get a bit more appreciation of what we do.
Excellent. Yes, so those will be included on the IFA Global Cafe website kind of in the next few hours once this session is uploaded. So thank you for providing us with those. We only have a few minutes left. This hour has flown by, but Dominic has a question. So Dominic is based out of Nova Scotia, a province in Canada. Dominic, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks very much. I'm enjoying this session. Yeah, I did some work with our local Alzheimer's Society a while back, and the research that they had come across indicated that people from Africa and Nova Scotian ancestry had about a two times higher incidence of Alzheimer's. So we are reaching out to that community to talk about ways to try and prevent the development of the disease or delay it. But I'm wondering if you've, in your research, come across anything to sort of support that, and also perhaps are there other socioeconomic groups? We mentioned about the role of stress, and when we think about how certain groups in society are far more subject to stress due to discrimination and other factors. So, any thoughts on that? I'd appreciate hearing from you.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. In our own country, we have indigenous communities that have a much higher risk. The risk is about threefold higher. And in their case, there is that I mentioned to you earlier about this genetic risk factor, this ApoE4, that's found in 20% of our population. It's much higher in that population. So that's a factor, and I don't know whether in this community they have an altered genetic risk factor, because that predisposes you to disease. And then if you, on top of that, you have certain lifestyle factors, that such as head injury, for example, certain behaviors that lead to that can compound the risk of dementia. So we need to know the background more of that particular group of people you're looking at to get a better appreciation of what may be the risk factors there.
Excellent, thank you. And something worth following up on, Dominic, if that's something you're interested in.
Most definitely happy. Please feel free to follow up with an email, Dominic, and we can engage.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So I'll ask Luana then to put your email in the chat, Dr. Martins, if that's okay with you.
Definitely is.
Perfect. Thank you. Next, we have a question from Peter Whitehouse about focusing an emphasis on public health rather than individual behaviors. Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Martins. I also want to have my congratulations for saying things simply and positively. I'm a bit more skeptical. I think as your talk unfolded, the complexities of Alzheimer's, the different kinds, the different genetic factors kind of emerged. And lifestyle, as one of your other questioners suggested, tends to put the focus on individual behavior. It does seem to me that prevention will require a collective action, which means public health for me in part. And I guess the two factors I pointed to are other health priorities that compete with Alzheimer's disease: air pollution, which is, I would like your opinion about how closely linked that is to Alzheimer's and dementia, and even the climate crisis itself, beyond air pollution, is contributing to poor quality of life amongst folks with cognitive challenges. We don't have all the money in the world. Australia pioneered pharmacoeconomics. So somehow I think our priorities need to be shifted. Do you agree that this is a complicated policy space? I'm sure you do. But public health specifically, could you comment about that? Thank you very much.
No, I think you're very right. It's got to be on a public health program. So people like me do the research. We've got the outcomes. So we're doing this big study, with, like I said, this lifestyle intervention. It's a $10 million study to see that. But then where do we go with this? We need to get it into policy, and we need to get into the public health. There's no question about that. And I'm looking for people who could help us to really take it to that next. We need economics, people who can do economic the numbers, so that we convince the government that this is the way to go. It's still far cheaper than trying to pay for the costs for people, once they've got the disease, to focus on this prevention part. But you're right, health, and you also make the point about the air pollution. We're just it's the basic. We're just at the end of this tip of the iceberg, so to speak. Is that lifestyle is only now being paid attention to, and every few months or a year or two, we get another important factor coming on board, and the air pollution is now. There's some very strong publications coming out to show air pollution is a very important feature, which doesn't surprise me, of risk of dementia. So that leads to basically, I was talked about oxidative stress, that increases oxidative stress that affects the brain. So countries where the pollution is very high, it's gonna be an issue. And likewise, in farming communities, here in Australia, many people who have been farmers have come to us and said that they've been exposed to certain chemicals. Nowadays, be a bit more careful that it puts them at a high risk. So they have a much more higher level of frequency of people getting dementia in those communities. So another form of pollution.
Thank you. And for anyone interested, last week we had one of the Swiss climate activists who successfully sued the Swiss government for their failure to act on the climate crisis and the risks that put specifically to older women. So worth checking that out if you're interested more on the climate crisis and impacts on health. So we are unfortunately coming to an end today. So I would love to hear your key takeaways on today's discussion, but to allow you to gather your thoughts. I'll first introduce our next week's topic and speaker. So please join our discussion next week, where we'll be joined by even more of Western Australia's best and brightest. In recognition of Pride Month, the IFA will be having a conversation with Ketty Crystal and Claire Hurst on the LGBTQI Intergenerational Life History Project, an age-friendly initiative of the Government of Western Australia. So Ketty represents the civil society organization responsible for implementing the project, while Claire is a director within the Department of Communities for the Western Australian Government. So this will be a fascinating discussion between those two stakeholders on their experience developing a soon-to-be published book. I believe it's published today, actually, on the experiences of older LGBTQI Australians, as told by the younger Australians responsible for interviewing them. So really looking forward to it. But first, back to you, Dr. Martins. Could you share your key takeaway message for our audience today?
Yes, Kira, I think I tried to share with you the excitement of these disease-modifying drugs. We're talking about it's only 18 months this is happening, and they're going to get better and better. But for people to get the best benefit of this, the early diagnosis is going to be critical. So, people are showing even the slightest signs of memory loss, they should go to their GP and ask to be sent to a memory clinic so they're properly assessed. Not wait another 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. That's what usually happens to be the case. Because that's when the drugs, if they get in early, are going to give them the best chance of a benefit for much, much longer. So prevention is really, really important. I mean, lifestyle matters. And so I mentioned about diet, the Mediterranean diet. People are now talking about the MIND diet, which takes into pay attention to vascular risk factors, as people who have hypertension. So that the DASH diet is combined with the Mediterranean diet. Obviously, exercise, good sleep is very important. Brain stimulation, but also things like dancing. Music and dance, which is movement, is also very important. So these are factors that we need to really pay more and more attention to, because prevention can really make a huge difference for at least half of us. So please do that. And if you want to learn a bit more about diet, have a look at Maggie's Recipe for Life, because we really put together a very nice story there and some beautiful recipes to follow. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And it sounds like a fairly nice invitation to perhaps also have a glass of red wine, a nice meal, go dancing. I can be on board with that. So thank you again so much for joining us today. It's been such a fascinating hour. And thank you very much as well to all of our attendees today. It's great to see everyone so active, and my apologies to those whose questions we weren't able to get to. You do have Dr. Martin's contact information if you would like to follow up further. And also just highlighting Jane Kermode, who was sharing a new government model in the US that's launched. That's a guide on improving dementia experience for those based in the US. So do check that out with the John Hartford Foundation. And a final thank you to the whole team at the International Federation on Aging, especially Luana, who makes all of this happen in the background. I hope you all have a lovely weekend and look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Kira, and thank you, Luana, and thank you everyone for your lovely question.